DigiTimes reports that NX is set to begin production in October. The report states that the initial orders will be finalized in February or March of 2016, and mass production will begin in May. Nintendo reportedly wants to prepare 20 million units for 2016, with a launch possibly as early as next July. There are a few things to note in this report's favor. First, DigiTimes is a trustworthy, well-respected outlet in China where it appears the production is taking place. And second, a 2016 launch isn't too far out of the question. It would put Wii U at a 4-year lifespan and 3DS at 5 years, or 3DS at 5 years, I suppose, which really isn't too shabby for either of them, considering how far sales have declined for both systems in the last few years. And it would also explain both why Nintendo had such a poor lineup at E3, and why they were suddenly, just this year, so unwilling to show off games in their longer-term future. Now, to the report's discredit, however, they did say that NX was previously confirmed to launch in 2016, which is totally untrue.
Yeah, all we know for sure is that we're going to get information about it in 2016, but not necessarily that it'll launch in 2016.
Right.
There are two interesting things about this to me, and one of them is that this would be a very un-Nintendo-like move, since typically they don't announce new hardware in the same year that they debut it. That's more of a move we've seen lately with Sony and Microsoft, both of whom launched their current gen now consoles in 2013, the same year that they announced that they were in existence.
Well, we also saw it with the Sega Saturn at E3.
Yeah, that worked out pretty well.
Yeah, that's the other side of it that interests me, because that would mean, if it's coming out in July, that would mean it's coming out right after E3 2016. And the only games that we know are coming out in 2016 so far are games that are releasing probably before E3 2016. So that makes me wonder, following what you said earlier, maybe they aren't showing Wii U games for next year because they're all going to be announced for NX.
Well, yeah, that's kind of what I'm wondering. I mean, we know, for example, we know the Mario team is working on his next big adventure. We don't know at all what it's going to be, but we know that after 3D World, they've said they're working on something. We've talked about how Zelda U might go cross-gen. We think it should. There's got to be, some stuff. And, it's always possible this report is not true. But if it is, I could actually imagine a scenario where Nintendo's saying, look, part of the reason that Wii U lost so much steam, and Miyamoto said this recently, we talked about it last episode, I believe, is that we came up with the concept of the tablet, and between that research and development phase and the time when it was actually on market, tablets exploded. And so all of a sudden, Wii U's appeal was just, it sunk like a rock. And so I could imagine them saying, look, we have to reveal what NX is and then release it when people are still excited about it and still interested in this new hardware.
Yeah.
So there are two parts of this rumor that I find really hard to believe. And one is, they just said, a week ago, that they don't like releasing big things in the summer because nobody buys games in the summer. So I can't see them launching new hardware in July.
Well, they did say possibly as early.
Right. I think 2016 is very possible. I think holiday 2016 could happen, but the as early as July part, I don't see. But the part I find even stranger than that is that they reportedly want to prepare 20 million units for the first year. And with the exception of Wii, no Nintendo console has ever come anywhere close to selling that in the first year. So unless they're somehow expecting to have the same kind of just, incredible record-breaking start that Wii had, there's no reason they would do that, because Wii U still hasn't even sold halfway to 20 million, and it's been out for 3 years. So that would just be a huge investment on Nintendo's part to create 20 million pieces of hardware when, there's absolutely no guarantee you're going to sell that.
Well, I'll flip that skepticism around and say they do tend to sell about 20 million units of hardware altogether when you combine their handheld and their console shipments. So it's possible, and I know a lot of people have speculated about hybrid systems in the past, but it's possible that maybe rather than a hybrid system, NX is really just multiple form factor all running on one platform, which is sort of a vision Iwata's outlined in recent presentations to investors.
Yeah, more functioning like iOS than...
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So rather than looking at their console performance or their handheld performance individually, maybe NX is just going to absorb all of that.
Yeah, and actually, if you look at the first-year sales of 3DS and the first-year sales of Wii U, combined, they're pretty much 20 million on the nose, actually.
Yeah, so one thing I want to say about rumors and reports, generally speaking, because I'm sure we have a few listeners rolling their eyes and saying, oh, why are they talking about this? But I know many people have a tendency to discredit rumors or reports entirely based on one inconsistency or one false assumption that the report makes. But that kind of dismissiveness is just not how we should treat this stuff. Skepticism is healthy, of course, absolutely. But it's also important to recognize what parts of a report have merit and which ones are a little less reliable. There's a classic parable from Othello where the senators of Venice are hearing reports of a fleet approaching Venice. One report says there are 107 ships, another says 140, and another says 200. And the Duke says to all these guys, well, hold on. Just because we've got conflicting reports about the numbers doesn't mean there's not a giant military coming right for us. We need to prepare for this. So, if you're listening, I mean, don't discredit this report or others based on like a couple of little inconsistencies, because the heart of the information may very well be realistic. And it's also very possible that this could be total garbage, but we don't know.
Yeah, sometimes you get the telephone game effect where you start with a true message and then it gets passed on to one person and they kind of put their spin on it and pass it on to the next person. So by the time you get to the end, there are some untrue parts to the report, but the core of it could be true, and it very much couldn't be as well, as Colin said.
According to Tamaki, one of the guys behind Unseen 64, which they reveal a lot of unconfirmed information before it's officially announced. They get their hands on all kinds of scrapped game content. They're actually the guys who revealed that 3DS Metroid game that Next Level Games tried to make. But he said that NX is not trying to compete with current-gen consoles as far as their specs go. He says, quote, "The NX is definitely not aiming to compete with the likes of PS4 on a power level. Absolutely sure of that now."
Yeah, honestly, I think anyone who was expecting it to was not really in touch with reality. Because that would put this NX in a price tier that Nintendo just doesn't belong in, frankly. They don't even belong in the price tier they're at with Wii U. As judging by the sales, judging by people's reaction to the price when it was announced, it's just not a good idea.
Well, some people have pointed out that this could mean that NX is leagues more powerful than the PS4 and Xbox One, but I mean, at that point, I feel like that's just fooling yourselves.
That's even more of a pipe dream.
Yeah, and Nintendo's only attempt to be the most powerful console in the market was the GameCube, which a lot of people don't realize, because the GameCube was awesome, but they don't realize it was a market failure. They got wrecked so bad that generation that Microsoft didn't even consider them a part of the console race when they were preparing for 360, when Sony was getting PS3 ready.
Which I find hysterical, because Microsoft's first Xbox sold about as much as the GameCube. And mostly just in America.
But every other console they've made, they've focused on lower end, more affordable technology, and then making up for that by having the best exclusive software.
Yeah, and aside from that just not making sense from a historical perspective, Samaki, his job basically is taking this hidden data and making it public. He's not attempting to speak in riddles. He's attempting, to explain things. So if he wanted to say NX is way more powerful than a PS4, he would have said, holy NX is way more powerful than a PS4. He would not say it's not trying to compete with PS4. I mean, this is Occam's razor here. The simplest answer is the correct one in this case.
Right. So I imagine what's happening here is that Tamaki has in some way seen the hardware that Nintendo's planning to use, and then he's drawing the conclusion, there is no way that they're trying to compete with Sony and Microsoft if these are their tech specs. Which also means if they're so underpowered that he says there's no way they're trying to compete, that does lend credence to the idea that's been circling around for a little while that NX is going to be some sort of hybrid between their handheld and their home consoles. Because, that sort of tech is nowhere near the level where it would be at a reasonable consumer price point, if it's going to be this hybrid system that's actually going to look even remotely okay on a television. It would make more sense that the specs are more like the Wii U than something closer to PS4 level.
Now, when you say seen the hardware, you don't mean physically. You just mean he's perused
like
the
documents
specs
or
list.
Okay. I don't.
Right, yeah, he was asked a little about that. Someone asked him on Twitter, what makes you say that? And he just said, talking to the right people with a smiley face. So he apparently has some inside source.
Right.
Well, this follows on to what we heard last week about how third parties apparently had seen something about NX at E3, in which case he would have a source.
Hello everybody, thank you for listening to this Nintendo Week clip, NWC. If you like what you hear, please subscribe to us here on YouTube for more highlights and discussion videos from Nintendo Week podcast, or subscribe to us on iTunes for weekly breakdowns of all your Nintendo news, discussion segments on subjects, games, and more, and tons of other features. Thanks for listening, and we will see you tomorrow with another NWC.